thank you so much for having me. It's always a challenge and an opportunity to speak at the end of the day when folks may have been having a long day. So I appreciate everyone still being here at the end of the day. I really want to give a thank you to Evangeline and the rest of the folks who put this together. It is a deeply important conversation to make space for new voices in the law, particularly people of color. So the space is absolutely important, and as someone who had to fight my own way into law school, has been a law professor, has run, has had many different stages of being a lawyer. At every stage, it is noticeable how much people of color are not yet in leadership. So this is a crucial space for continuing that pipeline, so more people can be in it. And it was actually a really great opening to talk about the why. And I kind of want to continue that conversation with you guys today, because I think perhaps earlier in the day there was a lot of discussion around how do you get into law school, right? It's sort of the hustle. How do we get to, it's like we just need to break into that space. So how do we get there? What's the programs financially? There's so many nuts and bolts of it. And it doesn't really change when you become a lawyer. In most spaces, we end up talking a lot about what kind of case are we going to file. There's technical discussions, and what gets lost often is why are we doing what we're doing and how do we do it? And I think for me, those questions are absolutely fundamental if you're interested, like I am, in thinking about justice in the law, right? And so I would say that the why, to me, I would ask for your going with me for the next 20 minutes on a sort of an assertion that the why should actually be social justice, and that sort of as people with a particular set of skills, we have a responsibility to do more with our law degree than just sort of advance our personal goals or advance the goals of our families, no doubt how worthy those goals are. And particularly because, let's think about the moment that we're in right now. We are in a particularly challenging justice moment in this country. We've been on the heels of sort of the ongoing crisis of police violence in our country. We are now also in a crisis in which 800 young people with DACA status is threatened. We're in a moment where the 3.3 million Muslim people in this country are threatened with a ban. We are in a moment where we've seen climate disasters here in my hometown of Miami to Puerto Rico, where people are drinking water out of Superfund sites. We are in a moment in which justice cannot be ignored. And for all of us that are either in the legal field or aspiring to be in the legal field, we cannot avoid the questions of justice. They're absolutely important to us. And we are in a moment, I think, that is not just, crisis and oppression are not new. It's historically what has been happening, certainly in this country from the legacy of slavery on, but also in the world. That is the history and the story of the world. But I think we are in a moment that is a critical moment for this country, in which our generation will have to account for what we did and did not do in this moment. I think 50 years ago was another tipping point in this country, right? The civil rights movement, the Black liberation and power movement. 50 years ago, there was another tipping point. And so I think I sort of implore you to, as you decide how you want to enter into this field and why, to really think about what is the context in which you're trying to enter into law school. So my story is I've been doing legal work. I've been a lawyer now for about 12 or 13 years, so it's been about 15 years since I probably sat in an auditorium not too different than this in California at UC Berkeley on my first day of law school. And I went to law school pretty clear that I wanted to do social justice work. But perhaps as many of you, as you've navigated the question of becoming a lawyer, certainly I think when you get into law school, you will find that the questions of justice aren't actually what we end up speaking a lot about in law school. And I really struggled in my years in law school to say, I thought I was coming to law school to learn about justice, and I felt like I ended up learning about oppression. The sort of rules and regulation of oppression, right? And as you read cases on property law, and you read cases on constitutional law, and you say the very foundation of the justice system, the way the law has been designed, and it's not broken, it works perfectly, is to keep people of color, to keep poor, marginalized people oppressed. And so what does it mean then to be a person of conscience, a person in this current moment, a person who is interested in justice, to be gaining those tools? And what I would assert to you is that it's absolutely critical that we engage a fight within the law. But I don't think it is as simple as it's not just about being in courtrooms. There's a much broader context to being a lawyer for justice. And so what I have spent my career really thinking about is the intersection of law and movements. I consider myself a movement lawyer. I think that is becoming a more common phrase and term. When I started law school, it wasn't. No one talked about that. And so for me, it's not just about doing litigation or taking cases. It's about how do we build and shift power with the law. It's a countercultural approach to the law. That's, as I said, the law is not designed for us to be the practitioners within it, and it's also not designed. And there, we can get more into why I would make that assertion, but the law atomizes problems. It says, it splits people apart from each other. It says that, if we want to do a class action, well, X person and Y person may live next door to each other and facing similar oppressions in their societies, but they don't count as being the same under the law. And these are sort of technical things that you'll learn, but I think what I'm trying to say is that the law in general tries to split apart people. And I think what's important to think about is why that's a challenge. So what I wanted to offer to you guys, as quickly as I can, were perhaps some ways to think about law. What I would say is sort of 10 or 11 lessons that I've learned over the 12 years that I've been doing this, 15 years that I've been learning about law, that I think were really helpful. I think they're also applicable if you choose to go down another career path. I think these are sort of good lessons that are relevant. So I'm going to kind of just start to go through them. So the first one is specific to people aspiring to be in the legal field. It's to stay the course. You are about ready to jump through a ton of hoops. You need to take the LSAT, you need to do your applications, you need to assemble the financial resources, and then you get there and then all of a sudden you're learning a new language and it's overwhelming and it should be taught. I mean, I taught law school, but when I was in law school, I was like, why does none of this make sense to me? It doesn't. It could be so much simpler, and it takes years before you're like, oh, it just really wasn't taught in a way that was sensible. And it didn't lean on the expertise and the knowledge that I brought into the room. So my first lesson, if I can impart, is to stay the course. It is going to be challenging, and it is going to be hard, but you've got to stay in it, and you've got to stay bold inside of it. So when you are sitting in a classroom and you don't agree with something someone's saying or it doesn't make sense to you, instead of quietening that thing and being like, I must not get it, actually making that louder and saying, you come into the room with intelligence, with experience, with your family histories, with things that build wisdom. So stay the course and lean on your wisdom. I think the second thing that I would say as a critical lesson for anybody that's interested in justice and the law is you have to run to the fire. If we think about moments of fire, most people run in the opposite direction of danger, right? That's human nature. Why would we run towards danger? I think if you are interested in being a justice person, a lawyer that is concerned about the questions of our time, you have to run in the direction of the fire. Run to the fire. One of my mentors, Bill Quigley, coined this phrase, which I keep very close to my heart. And that means we run to the fire because that's what justice demands of us. When people are suffering, our job as people interested in justice is to run towards that. Oftentimes people think someone else is on it, someone else is handling it, and the truth is that's usually not the case. And there's been many moments in my life when I followed the path of suffering and I actually met people in communities where they were at, you were surprised that there were not many other people there asking, what can we do? How can we be of help? And that brings me to, and I would say specifically moving towards the most vulnerable, right? Particularly intersectional ideas. I mean, it's almost a joke how much of an industry is built around nonprofit work and justice, and some of it honestly becomes very thin, and we start to look for favorable, respectable. We shy away from things that are complicated, from clients who are not perfect angels. And so I would say really try to focus on running towards the most vulnerable, the most forgotten, the people that live in the intersections of many identities and realities. The second lesson is not just to run to the fire, but to run to the fire without an agenda. And one of the things that happens when you become a lawyer, and maybe you're not feeling this now, but give it a few years when all of you will be in law school, is pretty soon it becomes, you're a pretty important person. You have this elite degree. People want to listen to what you have to say. You start getting told, you are the best and you are the brightest. And there is an elitism that we become socialized into. And what happens with that is we start to think we have all the answers, and we start to show up in places, and before we listen, we say, let me tell you what you can do. You can file this case, you could do this, you could do that. It may come from a good place, but my belief is that if you are interested in justice, you have to be able to go to the fire without an agenda. And really to observe and ask questions about what is happening and why, and listen to people's understanding of what is happening in their own lives. And this gets complicated for us as people of color, because you're like, I know that community, I came from that community, and you did. And that means you likely have more insight and understanding than other people do. But it doesn't absolve us of the responsibility of listening and of being of respecting the wisdom and the self-determination of even people within our own communities. So running to the fire without an agenda. My third lesson would be, or my fourth lesson would be, to question everything you will be taught about the law. I think being an effective human civil rights lawyer, what has been essential to that in my career path has been being able to internalize the limits of the law. Law is not the answer to everybody's problems. Oftentimes law doesn't even equal to justice. I mean, if law equaled justice, we wouldn't have the intractable problems that we have in our society, right? If we litigated the issue of school desegregation, if we litigated separate but equal, like why are our schools still segregated today, right? Law doesn't solve that, and part of the mythology that we're taught as lawyers is that we are saviors, we hold the answers, that social change happens through us. And my belief as a movement lawyer is it's just not true. It's just ahistorical. It's just not what has happened in history. And so you are going to have to build your own sense of how do I situate law in the spectrum of things that create change. And that's a complicated question, and that brings me to the next point, which is you have to develop a theory of social change. How many folks would say that that's something that you have, a theory of social change? It's not really it's not something where, there's no shame if you don't have one, because it's not a conversation we often have. What I mean by theory of social changes is really trying to understand, like, how does change happen? If justice is about trying to create transformative change, then why aren't we studying how change happens, right? And so for me, building an actual theory is something that requires study, discussion, engaging with people who approach it from other places, organizers, but also artists, creatives, people of faith. I mean, there's so many different people who are trying to answer the same questions. I believe you have to interact with all of that to start to develop a theory of change. And that theory then becomes your compass, because if you think, it's the old saying, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If your theory of change is law solves problems, then you're the savior and law solves everything. Which, as maybe devastating as it is, as you're trying to hustle and get into the law, is just not true. So how do you develop a theory that actually understands and incorporates the range of ways we can approach challenges in our society? And a theory is just that, it's a theory, right? It shifts and changes over time. It's a hypothesis, it's something you test. So if that's a sort of an unfamiliar concept to you, I would really encourage you to think about, like, what would be your process to develop that. And I think that's important before you go into law school, because law school is going to jostle you around. It's going to say, this is the truth, and you're going to have to be like, well, no, that's actually not the truth, right? So thinking about how do you prepare yourself for that. My next lesson, and someone definitely let me know when I'm running out of time. What happened to our time person? Oh, you're all the way back there.
Yeah.
Okay. So lesson 6 is learning inside and outside the classroom. And this is kind of reiterating this question of this point about wisdom. And there is a deep amount of knowledge to be gained from the classes. And this is a vocation, it's a skill. It's not something we're born knowing how to do a cross-examination or to write a brief. There's a very technical aspect to our trade. But I think it would be a mistake to use your time in law school and just focus on that. So go to the clinics, go into the communities, volunteer for things. As pre-law students, try to see if there are volunteer opportunities to start to understand, how does law live in the world? Again, you need to balance out the sort of book knowledge with the way that it interacts. And that, I think, is a collective process. That's the other thing too. It's that everything I have learned about the law has been in dialogue with my clients and the community organizations I've represented, but also with my peers and my colleagues, debating and trying things on and exploring. So really building a community and thinking about the time before law school and the time after law school as opportunities to really build that community. Okay, we're up to 7, and we only have a few more. So 7 is be authentic. And what I mean by that is, and this is particularly in my career, which I didn't give you guys my full background, but I've spent many years mentoring young law students, either as a professor and also as running a training institute. And I find it particularly challenging for us who come from communities that are dealing with different challenges, and that there's a sort of identity crisis at times when you become a lawyer. It's sort of like inside the legal space, you're not treated as an expert or an equal, but outside the legal space, you're sort of elevated in your community, and people expect you to know how to do everything, and you are an incredibly important resource in the communities you come from. And that kind of dissonance between maybe how you feel and what's expected of you, I think creates sometimes patterns in which we are unable to be authentic and unable to say, actually, I don't know how to do that. Because of where I'm situated, right? It doesn't matter where you come from. Once you become a lawyer, you have lawyer privilege. And that means you talk good, and people want to listen to you, and people want to take your phone calls, and they would much rather speak to you than, Miss Yvonne from the public housing projects in Miami. And so you really have to say, what does it mean to reconcile with privilege as it evolves through your educational transformations? And being authentic and knowing what your strengths and your weaknesses are. And I say that because I think, the law is given this, we are sort of told it's neutral and it is objective, and all of us inside of it are sort of neutral and objective, and that kind of creates a dynamic in which we are partially afraid to talk about things that are complex, partially afraid to say, I don't know, but it also creates a sort of dynamic in which we are sort of unwilling at times to sort of be honest about what we're good at and what we're, not everyone is great at everything. So I just say that to say, I think a lot of the socialization project of law creates this sort of puffing up process. And sometimes, and I feel like it's a complex thing, because in many ways, if you do justice work, you're a front line of defense for people that are going through really difficult things. I did tenant work for 6 years. I represented hundreds of people in evictions. In foreclosures, those are really difficult moments for people. And so sometimes, even if you don't feel powerful, your job is to, stand tall and tell someone, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I promise I'm going to fight with you. And that requires it, but then how do you sort of make sure you're doing that and also staying really humble, right? So it's that sort of balance of approach. Lesson 8 is to earn your reputation. And I say this particularly for folks interested in justice work. My mentor, who has been doing legal work a legal services lawyer for 40 years, he gave me this piece of advice in my first year of practice, and he said sort of, poor people never get to choose who their lawyers are. They don't get like, I can review 20 different people, interview them. It's usually like, this is the person who will represent you for free. And within that, there sometimes is a sense, well, like, I'm doing something for you, therefore I don't have to earn your respect or your reputation. And I think it's not, most of us are probably humble and good enough that that's not really how we want to approach the situation. But I think it sort of subtly comes in. And so my sort of advice to you is to think about, how do you earn your reputation? 15 years in, done a lot of speaking, people have a reputation and a career. Every room that I walk into that is a space in which I will be potentially helping someone else, I start again from scratch to say, there's never an expectation that I will be useful to you. There's never an expectation that you should listen to me. There's never that expectation. So how do we earn our reputation? And particularly, how do we actually do, I think it's really about doing what you say you're gonna do. I think you can kind of have fancy degrees and work in amazing law firms and gotten a very prestigious fellowship, but really what people want is for you to do what you said you were going to do. And I think if you can kind of think about your reputation as really trying to hold that sort of golden, I think that ends up really impacting how you are able to do your work. So last few. 9 is really trying to think about what values are going to guide your experience in law school and are going to guide ultimately your career. Values, again, are not something we talk a lot about in law school. It's not a conversation we have, I think, as a society very often. Maybe in our personal world, in our families, but certainly not in our professional worlds. I really think having a practice in which you sit down and you say, these are the values with which I want to approach perhaps law school, since that's imminent, and then after that, your career. And what do I mean by that? Not like I want to be a good person. I mean more like, one of my values will be that I will choose to confront, racism every time I see it or experience it. And maybe that's, unbearable for some people. I'm not saying that's the one, but I'm saying to come up with some ways some sort of commitments that you're willing to make as to how you want to show up in the legal space. And for me, I feel like this is certainly important as you move forward in your careers. Like one of my values when I started to practice was I don't want to create dependency. It was very important to me that everything I did was passing on power or skills or access or anything that I could do to create space for other people. And that sometimes means actually not doing something. It's not always about, it's about taking a step back instead of always being like, let me do this. It's actually saying, getting rid of dependency or sort of the elitism or the pedestaling of a lawyer means at times being like, you actually don't need me. Like, you can do this. I believe it. And I'll support you, right? So, building a set of values. Lesson 10 is to making the project of transforming yourself just as important as transforming the world. And I say this for particular reasons for us as perhaps voices that are coming from communities of color or from marginalized communities. And that is that, when we think about trauma, when we think about oppression, there are generational impacts of those things. They necessarily show up in our lives in different ways, and they will show up in your work as a lawyer. They will. They absolutely will. At times when I was doing cases, if I had a particularly sort of brutish opposing counsel that was, did a lot of huffing and puffing and tried to sort of threaten, sometimes it was hard. As a woman, as a person, you're getting triggered beyond just, this is just a theater of law. Like, it actually starts to touch something inside you. And what I started to learn was if I didn't deal with my own histories, if I didn't deal with the things that maybe our community, the generational or community-wise trauma, it necessarily shows up in our work. And this is not something we don't like to talk about, compassion or love, or these are not words you hear often. But I think it's super critical to think about the transformation of your interior as connected to the transformation of the external world. And not just on trauma, but also on high impact, low ego was a sort of anthem that came out of the movement for Black Lives. And I think what that was trying to say, which is like, sometimes being a really amazing person in the fight for social justice is not a particularly glamorous thing to do. It is something that is long meetings and long hours and no sleep and not enough time with your family. And sometimes all you're doing is ordering food and cleaning up something or making a sign, or it's not all like the amazing lawyer at the front of the room with your wind blowing in front of the Supreme Court. Like that's not what social justice work is. And so really thinking about how do you build the capacity within yourself to be interested in a very in being the kind of lawyer in which you're committed to impact, not to sort of personal ego. And so really thinking about that. So my last one is, oh no, I have one more, sorry, two more. Doing this work by any means necessary. If you're interested in doing justice work, you'll find, and people do that from a lot of different vantage points. I've never worked outside of legal services or nonprofit civil rights law firms. That was my personal choice. I didn't have an interest in working in another environment. But that's not to say that people don't do justice-oriented work from a lot of different vantage points, right? You can work for local government and be, trying to run civil rights cases. You can be working at a law firm and working on a pro bono docket. I'm definitely of the ilk that you do more when you work from an environment in which you have the free rein to use all of your time in service of our communities. But that's a personal choice, and it's a complicated one. And so, there's a lot of love for people to make choices that are good for them. But what I find is you'll receive a lot of information that says you can't do this. Oh, no, we cannot work for the movement for Black Lives because, that is like, those people are looting and burning stuff, right? Or, we can't work on that because, we have a member on our board who works for that company, right? So my imploring of you is to really decide, what are you going to do by any means necessary? What are the lines in the sand? And when people say, because our institutions, if the law wasn't designed to protect the poor and the marginalized and people of color, then certainly legal institutions are not designed to do that. So then the question becomes, when your institution or your manager or your boss says, well, we don't do that, what are you going to do in that moment, right? And I've been told that, and even though I've worked in very progressive institutions, I've also been told that. And so I think you have to decide when those moments come, how will you deal with them? And it takes courage, and it's not easy, and you may lose friends, and you may lose accolades, or you may be, but I think in moments of great crisis requires great courage. And so really thinking about, because those moments will come, they absolutely will come, and they will be harder because you're a person of color, and you will be held to a different standard than other people. And you will not be trusted as much because you're a person of color, and you will have to prove yourself time and time again, right? And so, because of that context, then how do you prepare yourself for those moments of courage? My last one, and I'm sure my time is up. My last one is, I get asked to speak a lot. I've probably spoken at over 50 law schools over I don't know. And what I find is people in good and sometimes in sort of difficult ways want someone to give them the answers. And I may have a few years of experience on some people, but I don't have the answers. And I think what's really important is that no one knows how to do this in the sense of I don't know anything, I don't know everything, and I don't think anyone has the answers to how justice work happens. I mean, these are enduring challenges, and it takes great creativity, people have to think outside the box. And so what I want to say is that we need you. We need you in this work, and we need you to come at it with fresh eyes and new hopes and asking, why haven't we tried this? Really, you have a rightful place in this work. No one needs a red carpet or an invitation to do justice work. We have a birthright to do this work. And so in that sense, I welcome each of you to this work. I know that, if you choose to do it, many of us will work humbly, shoulder to shoulder over the years. And even though I've spent a lot of time sort of saying, justice is challenging and we are in this challenging moment, I do believe that justice is possible. And I do think that any resistance begins with the belief that it is possible. So I really encourage you to take, the rest of this conference to kind of figure out where you're trying to go, but to really start to build in your mind, and hold that very dear to your heart as you get kind of pushed and pulled into the many directions at law school, the hustle, getting a job, figuring out how to pay for it. I mean, there's so many things that are going to consume your mental space. And so before you get into it, the more you can kind of center yourself and focus yourself and create your sort of set of values, I think you're really going to find that serves you well. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to give some of my own thoughts, and I definitely appreciate and would love to hear feedback later on, maybe in a question and answer, I don't know. Okay, thank you.